Hello friends, my name is JJ. So as we all know, one of the main objectives of the hit 80s era video game Pac-Man and its controversial feminist sequel Ms. Pac-Man is to eat a bunch of fruit. But what you might not know is that the forgotten third game in the Pac family trilogy, the American-made Pac-Man Jr., they decided to mix things up a bit by replacing the fruits with toys. You know, because he was a kid and all that. Now, if you think about it, this should have been a pretty daunting challenge for the game makers. Like, if we had to brainstorm a few iconic fruits for the first games, it wouldn't be that difficult. Strawberry, orange, banana, apple, yada yada. All simple, recognizable things that are easy to draw as little pixel blobs. But how do you do this with toys? I mean, what is a toy? A toy can be anything. The wonderful website Dinosaur Dracula has a profile of a toy catalog from 1983, which was the year Pac-Man Jr. was released. It contains all sorts of random nonsense like a Casio keyboard, E.T. action figures, a He-Man cosplay set, and something called Rub-a-Dub Doggy. So yeah, toy fashion tends to fluctuate wildly from year to year. I mean, here's a photo I took of a Walmart display advertising the hottest Christmas toys of 2021, featuring such surely timeless classics as LOL OMG Surprise Dolls, Minecraft Lego, and Crossed Signals, the Gotta Keep Up, How Long Can You Go
game that'll keep you on your toes and everyone else on the edge of their seats.
Batteries not included. But of course, as we all know in modern American culture, when you need to depict a toy in a work of popular media, like a cartoon or a Christmas decoration or a video game, no one ever bothers to make the toys look anything like what kids are actually playing with today. Instead, we usually represent toys using what the academics would call visual anachronisms, which is a fancy name for a stylized symbol of something that we have been culturally conditioned to accept as an iconic shorthand for an otherwise inherently fluid concept, like toy. Thus, in Pac-Man Jr., toys are represented by the following: a tricycle, a kite, a drum, a train, a cowboy hat, a skateboard, and a pogo stick. It's a pretty solid representation of standard American toy iconography, wouldn't you say? The only big ones I'd say they're missing are maybe a teddy bear, doll, toy soldier, and perhaps a rocking horse. Anyway, these are hardly the toys topping any kid's wish list these days, and in most cases haven't been popular in ages. So how have they survived as our go-to toy symbols for so long? Why is it that if I Google for toy clip art in the 21st century, I'm probably going to get a bunch of drawings of drums and trains? As I hinted at earlier, it all comes down to one word: Christmas. So, modern American Christmas culture is often said to be an outgrowth of Victorian British Christmas culture, which was a product of a truly heroic swirl of mid-19th century social cultural forces in that country. By the middle of the 1800s, the leaders of Protestant Christianity in England had come to embrace a very showy and ceremonialized understanding of religion. It was much closer in style to traditional Roman Catholicism than the stern, colorless Puritanism that had been so dominant in the 17th century. But it was also an extremely socially conservative time in Britain, and a time of great reverence towards things taken to be the traditional foundations of British civilization, including the countryside, the home, and the family. The late Industrial Revolution was also in full force by then, and it was making Britain into a much more wealthy and middle-class society, increasingly defined by the public's conspicuous consumption of high-quality factory-made goods. So the stage was set for a dramatic rebirth and reinvention of Christmas as one of Britain's major holidays, given its overlap with so many things that Britons considered important, like faith, family, ritual, and consumerism. Once minor Christmas customs accordingly became inflated by the Victorians into grand and important Christmas traditions, including presents. So, Victorian sentimentality meant that everything involving Christmas was supposed to be very grand and beautiful, and presents were no exception. If you were one of Britain's rising middle-class families, you would accordingly make a big show of giving your kids some very beautiful modern toy, something that represented the very best of the culture. And what kind of toys would those be? Well, the Industrial Revolution had been a real boon for the European toy industry, as factory people began to dream up creative new uses for the miraculous new technologies of their time. Once metal became cheaper and easier to make and mold, for instance, companies that formerly just made pots and pans or weapons, started making metal toys made of a new lightweight material known as tin plate, which was thin sheets of steel covered with tin. Companies who had used these new lightweight metals to make the tiny gears and springs that powered pocket watches likewise began experimenting with using so-called clockwork technology to make toys that could be wound up with big keys and then move on their own. The two most popular outgrowths of this were toy trains and toy soldiers, both of which used tin plate and clockwork to create toys that were considered the real pinnacle of high-quality children's entertainment in the mid-19th century and birthed a lot of what would become some of the world's most successful toy companies of the time, not just in England, but in Germany and America as well. There was some politics bound up in the success of these toys as well. According to the Victorian ethos of the time, it was important for kids' toys to impart the correct sort of social lessons to children, and giving boys toy trains or toy soldiers was seen as a way to get them interested in being engineers or military men, which were two of the most valued professions of that era, and sometimes it even worked. Winston Churchill, for instance, said that he was inspired to pursue a military career because of how much he liked playing with toy soldiers as a kid in the 1870s. Toy drums were part of this martial culture of toys as well. Drums, as I'm sure you know, used to be a big part of military culture back when marching in formation was considered a cutting-edge military strategy. A lot of early toy drums were even made by companies that had originally made full-size drums for soldiers, but were now able to make more drums than they knew what to do with. Having a drum of your own was another way that kids could have fun in those pre-World War I days when war was still considered a good and wholesome thing. Now, girls were given different toys, of course, namely dolls. Sewing machines and other contraptions of the vibrant textile industry made it easier than ever to mass produce not just soft doll bodies, but beautiful and elaborate doll clothing. The industrialized porcelain industry could make realistic doll heads, the glass industry could make realistic eyes, and poor people proved an excellent source of realistic human hair. The mid-19th century is now what collectors often refer to as the golden age of the doll, with many companies in France in particular establishing a thriving trade selling dolls to Britain and America. Like soldiers and trains for boys, dolls were also considered educational to the Victorians. They helped get girls interested in being mothers and dressing prettily and combing their hair and other things that were considered leading priorities for women in those days. But I shouldn't be too heavy-handed about this. Teddy bears were among the most popular factory-produced toys all over the world in the early 20th century, and there wasn't much politics in them. Gender neutral and peaceful, no one could find a problem with a teddy bear, except for maybe all of the goats they skinned to make the fur. Teddy bears were also interesting because they embodied a kind of nouveau primitivism that was very in vogue in toy culture of that time as well. Even though many people were in open awe at the wonders of the Industrial Revolution and wanted toys to reflect in miniature the changing world at the turn of the century, as this book puts it, there was also plenty of lingering anxiety that the world was getting too industrial and machine-driven. Toys made of more natural materials like teddy bears or wooden blocks or kites or rocking horses, which despite seeming ancient weren't actually a mainstream thing until the 1850s, were all examples of conscious efforts to bring a sort of old-fashioned Geppetto-esque purity to the toy world in an age of gears and steel. Anyway, the sentimentality of Victorian Christmas culture helped turn the high-quality machine-made toys of the 19th century into symbols of Christmas themselves. A shiny new toy train or dolly became as inseparable from the Christmas season as a grand Christmas dinner or glittering Christmas tree. Lovingly rendered illustrations of toys appeared in all of the Christmas cards and magazine ads and department store displays and all the rest of it. Though the United States of that time was experiencing a growth in wealth and industry similar to that of Britain and other parts of Western Europe, it was quite behind in terms of developing either its own toy industry or Christmas culture. And as a result, a lot of this stuff was just directly imported into American culture wholesale, either through trade or in many cases, European immigrants who literally brought these continental traditions to the New World. A lot of America's biggest toy companies in the late 19th century were founded by British, French, or German expats, for instance. Today, we are living more than 120 years after the formal end of Britain's Victorian era, and a whole continent away as well. Yet, our dominant understanding of what a proper, wholesome Christmas is supposed to be like remains very much bound up in these particularly British 19th century aesthetic preferences for for a particular kind of homey, happily bourgeois warmth and beauty, which, it should be noted, were themselves based around Victorian nostalgia for some imagined bucolic vision of old-timey England, or even old-timey Germany, which some British elites of the time, particularly Queen Victoria's German husband, saw as the purest reserve of authentic Anglo-Saxon culture. And it is from this heritage that we get today's weirdly dated iconography of toys. The Victorian era saw the rise of mass-produced high-quality toys, which were then sentimentalized by Victorian Christmas culture, and the lingering power of Victorian Christmas culture in modern America has kept our symbolic understanding of what is a toy frozen in this curious anachronistic way. Of course, it's not like we've made no additions to the symbolic toy canon over the years. As we saw with the Pac-Man toys, you're likely to see at least a few symbols of post-war modernity in these sorts of depictions too, with things like pogo sticks and skateboards, not to mention stuff relating to cowboys and robots, which are very much symbols of American television culture in the 1950s. The 50s might even be transitioning into a kind of new Victorian age in some ways, in the sense of how much we continue to sentimentalize a lot of their aesthetics as symbolizing a more wholesome time. The 1950s are now actually as close to us as the Victorian age was to people in the 50s, so maybe we should start expecting to see more of this. The whole idea of a golden age of aesthetic forms is a powerful concept in any culture and tends to be present in most of them. Though it can be easy to dismiss the world around us as boringly or even soullessly modern, it's worth reflecting on the degree that symbols from another era may still have a far greater hold on us than we realize. So in closing, I would be curious to know if you guys can think of any other good examples of a suite of mainstream American symbols that are anachronistic in the way that some of our symbols of toys are. What other out-of-date representations of things continue to loom large in the popular culture, even as very few of us actually interact with objects that look like that anymore? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.